Those of us who are in the workforce spend almost 25% of our time at work. 25% of our time during our working years is spent in that environment. And if you are working full-time and work a typical career, you will likely spend the equivalent of 12 full years of your life in the workplace. That's at a rate of 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, 12 full years. But how much time do we spend discussing what the Bible says about those hours? How do our spiritual lives apply to that time? What is it that God wants us to do with our work? And maybe even more importantly, how do we connect our Christianity and commitment to God and seeking things above to the workplace? What is the purpose of secular work from the biblical perspective? How do we seek things above in our secular work? In Colossians chapter 3, Paul begins by encouraging us to change our thinking, to renew our mind or heart or perspective, to seek things above, and then he makes specific applications to areas and relationships in our lives where that is the case. Yesterday, we talked about marriage, but one of which is our physical secular work, be we servants or masters, and we will get into those verses in Colossians chapter 3 later in the lesson. And this morning, I want us to follow that pattern that Paul gives us in that chapter. Begin with our perspective towards secular work, and then get into some very practical things in regard to what we ought to be doing. And so let's consider our perspective. I just want you to answer for yourself, and I would encourage you to give me a yes or a no or a 1 or a 2, something to at least acknowledge, okay, which one of these statements is true? Number 1, work is a burden and curse to be endured in long suffering before entering into the rest of heaven, where there will be no work. Or, number 2, work is an essential part of who we are as creatures created in the image of God and will endure throughout all eternity. Now, I will tell you that Christians, believers, have taken both positions throughout history, but I believe number 2 to be the truth. But how we answer that question is going to go a long way in how we approach and appreciate our physical work, isn't it? And what we are seeking in that work. Here is what we know from the Scriptures. We know that work bookends the beginning and end of time. Work is found before the grace of God that brings salvation was even needed in the perfection of the garden. And it is found after that hope that grace brings is fulfilled in heaven. Work is not evil, nor is it a punishment, as some would have you to believe. Instead, it is a part of God's perfect design for us as His creatures. Turn, if you would, again to Genesis chapter 1. Let's begin reading in verse 31 together. Then God saw everything that He had made. Indeed, it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the 6th day. Thus the heavens and earth and all the host of them were finished. And on the 7th day God ended His work which He had done. And He rested on the 7th day from all His work which He had done. Then God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because in it He rested from all His work which God had created and made. So what was God doing according to these verses when He was creating? He was working. And it's interesting that the word used for work here, the Hebrew word, is just a common word for our physical work. There is no special word for the work of God used here. And certainly God's work is far above ours, but they are both work. And as we are made in His image, we too are workers. Going back to chapter 1 and verse 28, after God created man in His own image, in verse 27, then God blessed them, the man and the woman, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Plants and animals go through their natural stages, but only man was given a job by God to subdue the earth, to have dominion over it. And specifically in chapter 2 and verse 15, then the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to, what's His purpose? to tend it. To tend it and keep it. There are some translations that actually say to work it, right? That is what he was supposed to be doing. And God gives man work to do, a helper to do that work with, and he says that it is very good. Now, doesn't that fly in the face of much of modern culture? That leisure is the ultimate goal for many. A lack of work is the ideal. That work is inherently bad and it's just an obstacle or maybe a means to further leisure. But such should not be the case for Christians. That is not the idea of biblical rest. Brooklyn, my younger daughter, her favorite place to eat in the world is Chipotle, the burrito place. Do y'all have Chipotles around here? It's kind of like Blue Coast Burrito. You know Blue Coast Burrito? So you go and it's like Subway for burritos. You go and you tell them what you want. But Chipotle is a very socially conscious kind of company. And they try and make their burritos more than just something that you eat. They've got all these other things going for them. And one of the things that they did is several years ago, they tried to put these quotes from famous authors on their bags that you take home to try and stimulate thought and conversation and so forth. I mean, it's just a burrito place, but they're trying, right? And here is one of the quotes that they put on one of their bags. Hope that, in future, all is well. Everyone eats free. No one must work. All just sit around feeling love for one another, by a man named George Saunders. And they posted these things on social media, and people, of course, commented on that. And this one ran across my social media feed, and there were a number of Christians who commented on what was said here. And one of these, this is an actual quote taken from social media. This believer says, "For me, what Saunders is talking about is heaven. Call me naive, but I think he is witnessing about his Christian faith." Well, commenter, you're naive. George Saunders is a Buddhist, first of all, and though he's a much more talented writer and intelligent a person than this quote would leave us to believe, I think, in fact, he is saying this tongue-in-cheek when you see the entire context of the quote. He's not witnessing of his Christian faith, and even if he were, he would be misrepresenting what that faith should all be about. And sadly, I think it is a misconception that many Christians share about heaven and our rest in heaven. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 28, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And at first glance, we think maybe that's putting work and rest against one another, that they are incompatible, that those two ideas are strictly opposed to one another. But what do the next two verses say in Matthew chapter 11, verses 29 and 30? "Take my yoke upon you, and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Because my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." So how do we understand passages like Hebrews 4 and verse 1? "Therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest, let us fear, lest any of you seem to have come short of it." Heaven is the place of ultimate rest. But that doesn't mean that we're doing nothing there. And some have described heaven this way. Maybe you've heard this kind of description, something similar to this. Heaven is like that day when you're out there working hard, maybe at your job or maybe you're working in the yard and it's hot and it's humid like it can be in Alabama, and you're out there and you're sweating and you're tired, and you come in from that long day of work and there's the easy chair and the sweet tea, and you sit down in that easy chair and you're at rest. And that's what heaven's going to be like. Well, that sounds pretty good. I like that easy chair as much as the next guy until you tell me I have to sit in that easy chair for all of eternity. Then all of a sudden it doesn't sound so good, does it? And so what will we be doing in heaven? How is heaven portrayed in our social culture? Well, heaven is we're just floating around on a bunch of clouds. We're playing our harps and eating our grapes and just sitting in our hammocks doing nothing. But rest never equals doing nothing in the Scriptures. Think of the times of rest in the Bible. The most important time of rest for the Jews was during the time of Solomon. They were free from their enemies. They were free from slavery. They were free from the division that had characterized the land before that time and after that time. It was truly a time of rest. But what were they doing during the time of Solomon? They were building the temple of God, and worship was established at that temple. They were working. They were working hard during the time of rest. Adam and Eve, again in the garden, certainly that is a time of rest. But what were they doing? They were keeping and working the garden. And I think if we're totally honest with ourselves, we know this to be the case. What is the most relaxing thing for you to do? Is it doing nothing or doing something that you really enjoy doing, especially with people you enjoy doing it with? Why do we go on vacations if the ultimate good is just to sit around and do nothing? Last year, my family and I, we went to Disney World, and I've got one of these Apple Watches where I can track my steps and how far we go and so forth. We walked on those days that we were there, we walked between 9 and 11 miles. And most of that time, I had a 4-year-old on my shoulders for those 9 or 11 miles. And by the end of that vacation, we were beat, right? As the old saying goes, I need a vacation from my vacation. Well, why do we do that? Why do we spend all that money to go to Disney World if we're going to be worn out afterwards? Because we understand that doing something that we really enjoy doing with people we enjoy doing it with is far, far better than doing nothing at all. We recognize that even not working bothers us and bothers the people who aren't doing it. My sister is an avid reader. I am too. I enjoy reading. And she recommended Persuasion to me by Jane Austen. Who in here has read Persuasion by Jane Austen? I got a couple of these. You don't know where the illustration is going, so you're not sure if you want to raise your hand or not, right? I read that book, and it's very well written. The characters are rich and deep and all of those sorts of things. And I got so mad and frustrated at that book because they have all these problems. They have all these issues with all these relationships and everything that they're doing. And I thought to myself, you know what would solve so many of these problems is if somebody in this book would get a job. They're going to their summer house and their country house. They have this vista and that vista, all these places they're going, and nobody's working. The work that God has created for us solves so many of our problems. And that is not us in heaven, where we are sitting around doing nothing. In Revelation chapter 22 and verse 3. Now, not all believe that this is referring to heaven. I do myself, but even if it is the glorified church or something along those lines, it is probably the best representation of heaven that we have. And in verse 3 of Revelation chapter 22, it says, "And there shall be no more curse, but the throne of God and of the Lamb shall be in it, and His servants shall serve Him." We will be doing something in heaven. We will be serving and worshiping God. And so work is found before sin and after sin is defeated. And that should inform our outlook, our perspective toward work. It is essential to who we are. And we will never be completely fulfilled without working in one way or another. Even in comparison to something as important as marriage, which we discussed yesterday. Work was there before marriage and will endure after the time of marrying and giving in marriage is over. Have you ever thought about that? That work was there before marriage and it will be there after marriage, and that institution is over. And so now the question becomes one of a practical nature. If work is what we are intended to do, we are designed by God to work and we are to be fulfilled in our work. What do we do in that in-between time? You know, the time before the perfection of work in the garden and the time when work is perfected again by God in heaven. What about us now? Well, like the rest of creation, work was corrupted by sin. Go back again to Genesis chapter 3, and then we'll make some applications. Genesis chapter 3, Genesis chapter 3 and verse 17, after the woman sins and she gives to the man, he sins also after they are tempted by the devil. They are hiding in the garden when God comes in and asks that question that our brother asked so beautifully, where are you? He still cares for them. He still loves them, but because of their sin, there are curses that are coming. Curses that come upon the woman, curses that come upon the devil, the serpent, and curses that come upon the man. Notice in verse 17, then he said to Adam, because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it, cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, and for dust you are, and to dust you shall return. There is a frustration to work because of sin. That's why our work isn't perfectly fulfilling. In the garden it was. But now, what does he say? Thorns and thistles keep us from accomplishing everything that we want to do. And that applies to much more of us in this room than just those who are in farming. No, those thorns and thistles are anything that keeps us from being totally fulfilled in our work. You know, there are times when we do everything just right. We do everything we're supposed to do, and the project fails. We don't get the promotion. We get laid off. Or months of work is rendered useless by someone up the chain of command who has no idea what they're doing. Or maybe the work that we're doing just isn't that enjoyable to us. We don't like doing it that much. Whatever the case might be, the writer of Ecclesiastes saw vanity in work under the sun here on earth. And so he should have, because our work is under a curse. So how do we deal with this frustration? Well, we seek things above in our secular work. We do God's will for our work. What does that look like? Well, it looks like three things. Seeking things above in our work means that we, number one, we do not squander our talents and opportunities from God. I like to think I'm a positive person. At first, I wanted to put this much more positively. I wanted to say that we need to use our talents and abilities. But the fact of the matter is, we can use some of those talents and abilities and opportunities from God and still squander what we have. To whom much is given, much is required. Instead, we need to have the attitude that the Apostle Paul had in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 10. I like what it says in the English Standard Version. I worked harder than any of them. I have this ability and I'm going to use it in God's service and the service of others. He says in that verse that it is by grace that I've been given it, and now I'm going to use it. And if I squander my gifts from God, it just adds frustration to frustration. And certainly Paul had in mind the spiritual opportunities he's been given there, but wouldn't it apply also to our physical talents and opportunities? What abilities do you have? What opportunities have you been given? How are you using them in good work? And I think too often we are missing out on the good work that is right there in front of us because we are thinking somehow that there is perfectly fulfilling work out there if we could only find it. But God places us all in different places where we might have influence and do good. We need to take advantage of the place where we are. I have a friend who is very, very talented in lots and lots of ways, but he's always quitting his job. And a lot of times it's been jobs that other Christians have lined up for him, jobs that he was good at, but he quits them. Why? Because there are things about that job that he doesn't like. Well, duh. Thorns and thistles, remember? We need to do the best we can where we are. We need Christian bankers and lawyers and teachers and administrators and carpenters and plumbers and CPAs and vets and doctors and law officers and nurses and stay-at-home moms. And yes, we need Christian preachers. Use your talents and opportunities where you are. There will be frustrations in any work. But am I using what He has given me in service to Him and others? And if I do, I trust that He will bring something good out of it. Secondly, seeking things above in our work means that we make our work benefit and bless others. I have another friend who is on the other end of the spectrum. He too is very talented. But for the last 35 years, in fact, 37 years, he retired a couple of years ago. He lives in Texarkana, Texas, and there's a huge Cooper tire plant there. And he has built Cooper tires for 35 years. Doing the same thing basically over and over and over every day during the work week for 35 years. We look at that and we might think that's an unfulfilling job. Not him. He sent me a video not too many years ago of him building a tire, and it was incredible. I have never seen anybody as good at their job as he is. The speed and efficiency with which he built that tire. But it doesn't end there. He was proud of that work, but that's not all he was proud of. Not just him individually. When he would drive down the road and he would see a Cooper tire, he's told me this. He says, I helped build that. And I'm keeping that car safe because I did good work in doing that. But that's not where it stopped for him. He had an influence on the workers that he worked with, on his co-workers. He brought many of them closer to Christ than they would have been without him. Some of whom even obeyed the gospel because of his influence. And at the end of the day, you know what he did? He left that job and he left work at work and he came home, and he is a fantastic husband and father and Christian and worker in the church. Is that an unfulfilling job to him? No, he sought things above in making tires. So too all of us can seek things above. For him, it was not about him. It was about what he could do to serve and bless others. How he could be a blessing in the work that he did. And certainly that's what God does by His grace. If we are seeking things above, we need to seek to imitate Him in all things, including our work. We should seek to bless others, even when they don't deserve it. And that's what we should seek in our work. How can I bless and benefit others rather than just myself? Rather than just a paycheck that I'm taking home? And certainly that blesses my family. But what else can I do to bless others and benefit others because of the work that I'm doing? In Acts chapter 18 and verse 3, we are told that Paul was a tent maker by trade, and he used that skill as a way to teach others, to be an example, and to support himself in the preaching of the gospel so as not to be a burden to others. In Acts chapter 20, verses 32 through 35, when they're with the Ephesian elders, what does he tell them that Jesus' idea, Jesus is saying was? It was more blessed to what? To give than to receive. We are taught to support the weak through our work. That we work so that we might have something to give to him who has need. That we give through our work. Yes, we support our own families. 1 Timothy 5 and verse 8, if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. But we also support others through evangelism. For most of us, where is our greatest contact with the world at large? It's at work, where we are to be a blessing to our bosses, a blessing to our employees, a blessing to our co-workers, a blessing to our clients. We extend grace in the form of salt and light. We reflect the light of Christ where they are closer to Jesus because of their interaction with us. Secular work is not beneath the Christian. It is worthy of our time. And it is worthy of our time in all things. Not worthy of our time. You know, we have more spiritual endeavors that we want to get to, certainly. But we need to fulfill our God-given purpose in our work as well. You think about the context of 1 and 2 Thessalonians. It was in the context of Christians who had essentially quit their jobs and were just sitting around thinking about spiritual things, being busybodies in other people's affairs, and waiting for Christ to come again at any moment, that Paul says what he does in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, "But we command you, brethren, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you withdraw from every brother who walks disorderly and not according to the tradition which he received from us. For you yourselves know how you ought to follow us. For we were not disorderly among you, nor did we eat anyone's bread free of charge, but worked with labor and toil night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. Not because we do not have authority, but to make ourselves an example of how you ought to follow us. We could have demanded payment from you, but that's not what we wanted to do. For even when we were with you, we commanded you this: if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. For we hear that there are some who walk in a disorderly manner, not working at all, but are busybodies. Now those who are such we command and exhort through our Lord Jesus Christ, that they work in quietness and eat their own bread. But as for you, brethren, do not grow weary in doing good. And if anyone does not obey the word of this epistle, note that person, and do not keep company with them, that they may be ashamed." To many in the religious world, there could have been nothing more spiritual than just sitting around and talking about spiritual things, waiting for the Lord to come again. That's what they were doing. And what was Paul's response to that? Get back to work. Ultimately, our calling is spiritual in nature. And there is a time coming when those frustrations of work will not apply. But whatever we do for income, we all work for the Lord first and foremost. Which brings us to our final point. Turn to Colossians chapter 3. We should seek to work with fervor and gratitude because of the one for whom we are working. Read verses 22 through 24 with me. "Bondservants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God." Verse 23, "And whatever you do, do it heartily, as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ." We need to work and work heartily as if we were working for Christ. Christians should be the very best workers on any job site. They may not like us, they may not appreciate us, they may deride us for making them look bad to the boss. But they need to begrudgingly admit that we work heartily, doing the very best job that we can as diligently as we can, that they see our good works and glorify our Father in heaven. What kind of carpenter was Jesus? What kind of tent maker was Paul? What kind of fishermen were Peter, Andrew, James, and John? There is a powerful illustration that we sometimes just run over there in verse 23. You are not working for your boss. You are not working for your co-workers. You're not even working for your family. You are working for the Lord. Have you ever done a job for someone who was really special to you, that you really cared about? My father-in-law, his nickname is Laban, because the joke is that his sons-in-law have to work 7 years hard labor to marry one of his daughters. There's a lot of truth to that. My father-in-law is a very handy guy. He can do lots of things. The first time I met the family as the boyfriend, they were putting a roof on a house in Ohio, my wife's grandmother's house. And this house was one of those Ohio houses. It's got a basement that comes up about 3 feet or so. Then it's got a tall first story, and then it's got a second story, then it's got an attic. We were putting a roof on that house. The pitch of that house, it just looked like it was straight down. It looked like this. Maybe it was like this. I am deathly afraid of heights. Deathly afraid of heights. I didn't tell a soul that. Why? Because I wanted to impress the people that I was working for. I'm from Texas. I know how to work. I've worked all my life. And so you know what job they gave me? I had to take the bundles of shingles up the ladder, across the top of that roof, down the roof to where they were laying them, and then go down and get another one and come back up. By the end of the day, I couldn't hardly feel my legs. They were shaking so bad. But I cared so deeply about the ones that I was doing the job for, I was going to do a good job no matter what. What if we really were doing the work we do for Jesus? We wouldn't cut corners. We would check and double check. We would show up early and leave late if that was appropriate. We would do everything in our power to do the very best job that we could. And to top it all off, we would do it with a smile. Well, that's how we should work. And we look forward to the time where no thorns and thistles will be there for our work, where it will be totally fulfilling. As a song that we sing sometimes says, "Joy to the world, no more let sins and sorrows grow, nor thorns infest the ground. He comes to make His blessings flow, for as the curse is found." Seek things above in our work now, and we will find things above in our work there. Thank you for your good attention.